Welcome to Outer Space, International Arts and Class Struggle Podcast.
Prepared and unprepared. The rhythms of art and politics. An interview with Joey van Leeuwen. Hello, I'm Rob MacDonald and I am your host for Outer Space International Arts and Class Struggle podcast. This podcast is part of a series of podcasts that we are doing related to the historical memory of the Spanish Civil War, particularly the Solidarity Park project. So we're going to be talking to lots of artists involved in that project. What are their reasons to be involved? How do they see the fight against fascism and the far right today? But also their general political outlook, and touching on many of the questions that the podcast normally talks about. We're also going to make a bit of investigation into the role of women in the struggle for the historical memory today, the recuperation of the memory. We'd also like to thank the Diputació de Barcelona and Amicel, the International Brigadistas Association in Catalonia, for their support in this project. Okay, let's go to the podcast. Hello, today we're joined by Joey van Leeuwen. Hi Joey, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Rob. How are you?
Yeah, good, man. Good. Thanks for coming on the show. Joey, as I understand you, you are originally from New York. When I knew you recently, you were in Boston. Present time, I think you're in Sri Lanka, of all places. You're a drummer and a jazz composer, and you performed with your trio in the last Solidarity Park International Festival, albeit online because of the COVID stuff. So we got you on the show. We'd like to know more about you. So that's a sort of short introduction of what I know. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Well, I mean, just about my music, I was brought up doing jazz. My mission has been, to weave together all these threads of like a lot of different kinds of music. Which is, why I'm here in Sri Lanka. I'm actually just renewing my visa for India because I'm living in Chennai in Tamil Nadu right now, studying Carnatic music. So working all that stuff together, also Marxism is a big part of my music. That's how we met when we were both in ISA. And
Yeah, that's it. I mean, the interesting thing, you talk about Marxism and which has, in some ways is very simple, but in lots of ways is quite a complex human way of understanding human society, lots of different theories and interesting stuff. But also you talked about jazz, and then you talked about going to India to learn different drum patterns, and for what little I know from Indian drum patterns, they're a very different timing kind of thing, and jazz itself is it's not your straight 4/4 and fuck off that the rock and roll man might talk about. So I'm kind of interested because you performed some music for the Solidarity Park Festival, a jazz piece. I'm kind of interested in your understanding of the complexities of jazz music and drumming, and what's your process when you're thinking about performing? Because if I talk to somebody else, I say, well, okay, you're singing about this or you're singing about that, and it's an easier conversation for people to understand. But when you talked about mixing your Marxist side with your music side. I'm interested, how does that process work in your head?
When I think about, music, what I see music as being is, that we learn how to like communicate, emotional content. I mean, obviously, like music as a language, just like any other language, for me, I see my own ability to communicate as being like hinging on like my ability to, put into words what I have to say, and then like also the importance of like what I actually have to say, so. When you talk about Marxism, I think Marxism is one of those things that like the progressive kind of like music that I play, like on one hand, like there's an element of like simple like appeal to like, our morality, like we're against exploitation, we're against imperialism, we fight for like common working people. And then on the other side, like the execution of it is very complex, and talking about like the piece that I did for Solidarity Park called Choosing Sides, that also has both of those things in it, so one thing that I learned several years ago when I was in New Orleans, was a teacher said to us, "Oh, well, try writing a song based on like Three Blind Mice or like some really, really simple melody, And so this melody came to me where I'm just, going like 3, 2, 1, and then 3, 4, 5. So it was quite simple, but then like the background of it, gave it this complexity, because on one hand, like you're just doing these like mode mixtures and things, like kind of the chords in the melody are moving in opposite directions, and for me that like kind of captured the tension of the decision, and I was thinking about my work, being like a Jewish organizer for Palestinian solidarity, and how like purely based on like who I am, like who I should be according to society versus like what I feel is actually right, and that tension. And then like going through this song, like trying to capture this like, feeling of like this like bittersweet, like, knowing that like you make choices, that separate you, just as how we do as Marxists, choosing rather than to pursue this kind of like quasi-universalist, Gandhiism or, that kind of viewpoint, that we put ourselves firmly on the side of the working class, and what kind of like tension that produces like within ourselves when we choose sides.
I think it's really interesting actually. One of it's obviously called Outer Space International Arts and Class Struggle Podcast, and the Class Struggle Podcast bit is important because for me that sort of denotes the class antagonisms in societies, and I think many people forget that that's the key to understanding all things that are going on human. And also if you go deeper into science and modern sciences, the antagonisms between two forces create another situation. And in a sense, I find that really interesting how you sort of tie in the sort of the musical understanding with your understanding of Marxism, because I think the two things coming together is very much what this podcast is about, but it's also very much what the Solidarity Park project is about. It's about bringing musicians and artists and and art in a broad sense together to sort of build a common banner, if you like, against the rise of the far right. And we'll come on to that maybe in a bit more, because I'm really interested in America and your opinions of those kind of things. But You use jazz, yeah? You said you use all sorts of music. I mean, is jazz your main
Jazz is
thing,
my
or?
background, and like for two reasons. One, because, I love jazz. It's like the music, of like my country. Like jazz is American classical music, so um and then, I went to school for jazz. That's also like the background in which like most people learn how to like, work through their instruments, at least in the US, so that's kind of like where I started, being like a teenager and being like, oh, I like jazz. I want to learn jazz. I want to do a lot of things, and then like getting more and more into it and realizing that like it's such a deep and rich and complex tradition, with so much in it, not just like with regards to like what musicians can do, but also the politics of it. Obviously like jazz as being like somewhat of like a Black nationalist movement, jazz against racism, going all the way back to like, the beginnings of the music, Duke Ellington, Black, Brown, and Beige, Max Roach, the Freedom Now Suite, etc., Archie Shepp, all these people, even John Coltrane, and Miles Davis, the tribute to Jack Johnson, so, but yeah, so my background is in that, and it's the lens through which, I process other music, and in some ways it's like helpful, and then in some ways you also have to unlearn it, in order to try and take on like a universal perspective. And but I was lucky to have like really great people in my life that were able to show me how to see beyond the surface, to see what the like Advaita people would call, Brahma, like creation, like the fact that a pot is a form of clay, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm not a jazz musician. I mean, the music that I played, we threw the word jazz in. We were like I don't know, indie sort of progressive rock, I suppose, with a mixing of techno and stuff. That's where we ended up. And we threw the word jazz in there, and we had a little bit of element of that. But I think when we did that because it's a radical word. It has a connotation of shaking it up a little bit. No, jazzy. I mean, it's a soft word, and one say, but in another, it's not. I suppose when I think about jazz, I think of two things. And they're sort of counterintuitive. One is that jazz is really radical. It's like change the laws, break the norms, and in the other, it's actually quite traditional trad jazz itself, and it's very, has this old man image. And certainly my experience of it was with my dad. He used to take me and he used to sometimes play, and the music was like not really modern, not really happening. And then you go to the other spectrum, which I would say, drum and bass and all this kind of stuff is based on jazz loops and this kind of thing. So I'm interested in that. What's your opinion on that? Do you think jazz is instringently, if that's the right word, a radical form, and therefore it kind of mixes quite nice with the things that you talked about, the history of jazz and how it's radical and its roots, or am I reading too much into that, do you think? What's your take?
I think, yeah, that makes me think, really of the book What Is to Be Done, because
By Lenin.
Like I think when you talk about like Leninism, like it's the same thing, like it's like, and Marxism, like it has both of these things. It's a radical, and like there's this need to like constantly inject it with new ideas, new perspectives, and like constantly updated to the changing times. But then at the same time, like, Lenin said this one thing, like, like we have this objective, a certain level of objectivity in which we say, okay, you're treading into a swamp, right now with the way that you're going, and you can go there if you want, but we are going to, call it like it is. And I think that when you talk about the tradition of jazz, like, there is that, because, on one hand, like, you have this like, this inventiveness, and this constant like need to like update it, but also like, the context of it, I think is a big part of what defines it. I know for me, as my experience in the American educational system, that this is one of the issues of like huge controversy in jazz, which is jazz education, because jazz education is mostly about the practice and very little about the like history, and so basically it leads to a lot of like basically cultural appropriation, right? Because you've got people who've learned all the techniques of jazz, but they don't understand, Black American history. They don't understand like, you've got musicians that are playing like the music of Max Roach, and then they're like, fans of Donald Trump. They're, when, if you knew like about Max Roach's life, like you would know that he was like a socialist, he was a militant, activist, who like, wrote, performed music about Mao, he wrote militant like music for Black struggle, and was an internationalist and did all these things, so yeah, I think that aspect, there's two sides of it. There's like,
I mean,
it's a situation that every musician has to negotiate in an individual way, but then in another perspective, like the community also decides.
Yeah, it's there's a dynamic there which is interesting between historical stuff and the living idea of something. And for me, Solidarity Park, for example, it's a community arts project and it's historical memory project, that run the two things, and we work in schools and various other things that we do. But that link about learning the history or encompassing the history, and one which is very complicated in terms of the Spanish Civil War. But it's also, historical memory is not just about what happened in Spain in political stuff, is it? You're talking about, in America, and the learning of those things and how they marry up. And certainly, when we talk about Marxism and Marxism also, that is there too. There's, one of my problems with quite a few Marxists is they don't want to think outside the box, outside the traditional values, and they don't want to challenge themselves. They want to stick where they're safe. That doesn't mean that they're wrong, and it doesn't mean that I'm right when we talk about certain issues. But I think this modernization versus traditional is also about the present struggle and historical memory. The two things are there, and they work within music and they work within politics. So maybe we've sort of tidied something up there. I don't know. Would you agree with that sort of understanding of it?
Yeah, because look, we see this huge debate, happening in all over the world. Talking about DSA, Syriza, Labor Party, like this resurgence of, like social democratic, activism. And like, for people who do have the like initiation into this like memory of the working class, like we see already like I mean, I think it's a clear question of like, well, why would you want to try to vote your way into socialism when we've seen over and over again that it's failed? Right? I think that's a one way to put it. You know, when you talk about jazz, it's the same thing. I mean, you know, the things that people do with the music nowadays, they were doing 100 years ago, you know, and those, now we look back and we say, well, it was so obvious that, like, you know, minstrelsy was wrong, you know. Back at the time, you know, there were so many people that clung to it, even though they could, well, we can't read people's internal thought processes, but, you know, we were right and they were wrong then, and now we want to try and move forward, you know, away from, for example, this reformism. You know,
I mean, one of the things I found in just being so close to, I mean, I had an understanding of the Spanish Civil War before I came and lived in Catalonia, and I've been here a long time now, and I've been involved in this particular project for quite a long time. But it's interesting how one of the parts of the Solidarity Park project was to learn about what actually happened on the Ciudad de Barcelona, at the same time as we were trying to teach that to the new generation, what had happened there, and expand a wider story from it. Interestingly enough, just researching what happened, all the different opinions and angles, if you like, that the history came from as we built up a picture. Now, there's a generalized similarity, yeah? But each report is different, written in a different way, coming from a different perspective, coming from a different individual, different thought process, you know, and then, of course, you have to generalize. But what you end up sometimes with things that don't agree with each other. And also the lessons that you learn from it, some are particularly relevant on one day and on the next day they're not, you know, in terms of updating it. And I think music composition is very interesting. I've heard people say, well, there's nothing new under the sun. You know, and of course that's completely wrong. Everything's new every time the sun comes around, but it's based on, you know, what came before. I don't know, that dialectical process, I think, is one of the important things in understanding how to fight and how to present yourself in the struggle of the day. But you don't go out thinking I'm going on strike, and then you're not thinking about those things. You're acting. You know, and it's maybe that's a bit like going on stage when you're playing the music. You've done all the theory, you've done all the talking, you've done all the composing, and then you go onto the stage and you perform. You're an activist. I don't know. That's what I'm reading from our to and fro a little bit. This interconnection.
Exactly. Right. Like, what non-musicians don't understand is that you prepare and unprepare at the same time. Yeah. when you perform, especially when you improvise, you know, like, you showing up to work, you know, with an empty toolbox, you know, is a bad move, but it's just as bad of a move to, you know, just take a screwdriver and keep just banging a nail with a screwdriver when you know you need a hammer. You know, you need to be flexible enough to react to the moment, and at the same time you have to have the tools to be able to actually do that.
Yeah, and from a stonemason sculpture's point of view, you quite often have to make your own tool. You know, you quite often can't reach it with the chisel, and you weld on another piece of metal so you can get down into that bit. So it's actually, you know, that process continues. Yeah, prepare. I like that. You have to prepare and unprepare. I mean, I think to unprepare is, let's explore that a bit. I mean, how preparing is obvious. I think everybody would get that, yeah. But how do you unprepare for something? How would you? I mean, I understand immediately what you mean, but could you expand on that? How do you unprepare for a piece of music or for an activist?
Yeah. I think the thing that you have to do, I mean, for me, the thing that I have to work on the most always is not comparing the music in my head to the music that is actually happening. And this is something that musicians struggle with all the time, right? Which is like playing something and thinking like, oh, that was terrible because it wasn't what I intended to do. You know, and not listening to like, maybe what you did was better than what you intended to do. You know, and there's no template, you know, that says like, you know, this is what you meant to do, so therefore, you know, you screwed up.
Yeah, I think that's really, it's like, I read you with that. I feel the same. You know, you have to be open for errors and to allow them and to exist with them, you know, and not count them as errors. In fact, because I mean, when you're writing a piece of music or you're thinking about it, now I'm not on the level of you with mine, but I would have to write the drum patterns, you know, within the band I was in, you know, and sometimes there would be parts of it which you would allow space to be what came. You know, but at the same time, as a drummer, you're performing a role, particularly in the different genres. So, how would you? I mean, can we tie that to political action? Because I know people will be listening now and go, "Oh, that's all very interesting," but they're talking out their arse a bit. They're going in there, but actually, both of. But, yeah, I was just going to say, both of us are not those people.
I take my drum to a protest, you know, and I just have this big bass drum, and I just bang on it, you know, and it gets people pumped, you know, like they chant like twice as long, you know.
I think there's an interesting thing here with drummers. I mean, let's digress just a little bit because I want to come back to the main thing that we were going on. But drummers at demonstrations, I love the samba band or the big bass drum getting people going. But sometimes, particularly I remember in the 90s, there was a lot of that. And it used to take over from political chanting. And some people would go, you know, this is where the traditionalists would come in. They say, well, it's not very good. We've got lots of, it's like a carnival. And that seems nice, but it's not political. And I was like, fuck me. You know, you're not getting this. Because this was around in the 90s. There was like the do-it-yourself music, movement that happens and all this. We won't go into that too much, but there was a lot of these sort of bands playing and they would take away from the political chanting and the political message, but actually what they were doing is injecting energy into the situation. And that's what I hear what you're saying, and for me that's a very direct connection with your music, with the protest, and I hear what you're saying, but I think people listening might go, well, that's very nice. You know, music has a role to play. It's a secondary role, etc. But why don't you get out and do something would be, you know, what people would say. And now I know you and me, we get out and do something as well. You know, I'm a little bit interested in how you, I mean, just to sort of change the direction, to take what we've talked about and put it in context. I'm a little bit interested in how you've tried to approach organising fellow artists. Have you got much experience with that? What's your outlook there? Man,
I mean, organizing artists is like herding cats. You know, there's I have actually a document that but anyway, so there's like so many challenges with that. I mean, for one, you know, freelancers, you know, are it's really difficult to organize freelancers because like we're competing with each other, you know, we don't have any kind of like, you know, organization within the workplace, you know, also the legal structures that are in place, you know, so freelance work means you don't have a regular workplace or consistent coworkers or legal protections provided by unions. You know, communication with other workers only can take place off the job and informally. And like, for example, in the US, like you can't get collective bargaining rights through a union with a music venue. Because of this really screwed up law, you know, the employer of a musician is the band leader, right? And obviously that's fucked up because in 90% of gigs, the band leader, so to speak, is just the person that booked the gig, and then the band is going to split the money evenly anyway. So what's the point of negotiating with your band leader and demanding more money, and then the band leader has to say either that they're going to take money from themselves or someone else in the band to give to you, or they're going to go and demand more money from the venue, which is then just going to say no.
Yeah, I think
so.
I mean, there's a big core question there that you're raising, and it pops up all over the place and all the time. And there are different band leaders, but in general, you're not working for one people. Sometimes you get one person who it's their band, and that can be different. But at the top of the show, we talked about the class struggle. And I think one of the things that this podcast has discussed quite a lot of times in previous shows is the class nature of artists, where we sit on that spectrum. And it's a very broad discussion, and it depends on circumstance. But it's often the case that artists are working class in their life, in general, and their money and their whatever. But in the actual relationship with their employer, it's often in a sort of a middle class. We use the word freelance. Yeah, I mean freelance. If you follow that through, it's a petty bourgeois sort of position in society, and so artists are caught in this sort of nowhere land. Often, majority. Some are very clear, but the majority of artists are often in this sort of where it's hard to find your natural place in the class struggle or in the class workers' organisations, and they're often not that warm to artists. And then the opposite is also true. So I think when you talk about the difficulty of organising artists, we're kind of, that's one of the problems, hey? And for me, it's about, well, where should, as an artist, should I orientate towards? So I don't know. Do you get that? Do you think that's about right or not?
Yeah, I actually used your interview about the class nature of artists for my VMU lead off as some of the inspiration, because that's kind of what I said is that, because on one hand, yes, we're technically petty bourgeois because we sell our own products that we make with our own hands. But then on the other hand, we are bound to this system, and artists are historically poor. We don't have this bargaining power that the typical petty bourgeois has, and also that the integration of the arts industry into capitalism, actually, I don't know, it's proletarianizing because for myself as a musician, I technically sell my own music, but I would go into a club 200 times a year and I would play mostly the same music, for basically piecework. So it's not really I don't know. I mean, I think, in leftist circles, sometimes there's a viewpoint of artists as being people who don't have a connection to the physical world and therefore are lacking the seriousness of perspectives, because we're not pounding steel, or, holding the thread of the life of a nation in our hands.
And this goes back to this traditional thing we were talking before. I don't know how we would characterize it, but this idea of the traditional view versus the present reality view, and I think this crisis within the organizing of the left in general is reflected very deeply in the crisis of artists and how they tackle organization, because there's been a modernization. Capitalism is always on the move, not because it always wants to, but because it has to, because everything has to move and change. But I think one of the things maybe we're unraveling here is this traditional stuck kind of view, which wants to probably be up to date, and the actual reality of the situation. I mean, it reflects itself also in the Solidarity Park project. One of the things we want to do is build a festival, and we've done 2 online ones, and next May we'll do a real festival. But we have a problem. I'd like to say to you, hey, Joey, bring your band over. You can play, man, for real time. And you'll go, great. Where's the airfare? Where's the accommodation? Where's the wages? And I'll go, hey, man, this is the cause. And you'll go, yeah, of course, I'm coming. I'll spend my savings. Now, some people will do that and we'll crowdfund and whatever. But here we are, a radical arts collective, if you like, talking about all these things. And the reality facing us is to put on a festival. We've got no money unless we go to the governments and then, get government grants. And this is one of the complications we have at the moment in the project. And so, I mean, you're the person who's meant to be interviewed here and I'm going on one of my rants, but this is a complication. How do you think we can overcome it in terms of artists?
That's hard to say, but I mean, I think that, the more that we agitate, for control over our own industry, I mean, there's a massive amount of resources flowing into the arts industry, and so much of it goes to a lot of it goes to the top earners, but even like when you talk about people like Beyonce, like they're not really getting like the majority of the money. Like most of it is going to like executives, people who know nothing about art. Like people who have never performed and can't carry a tune, and building.
So what you're saying there is the classical class contradictions that exist, and that's how we should focus.
Well, I mean, I would love to be able to say like, like there's some. I have some great idea that's
I mean, we're pulling it out,
for Solidarity Park. I mean, I face the same thing with like, getting, money to fund my projects, to fund my albums and stuff. I mean, I pour money out of my own savings, to fund my albums. Every time I run at a loss, and then I make that money back through performing or teaching. So yeah, I don't know, but I mean, I think that there is a lot of good work in trying to like put that back. I mean, for musicians at least, the situation didn't used to be this dire, during the like kind of, golden age, right, of recorded music. Because the Beatles could, go like several years without any live performances and still make tons of money, right? And that's an extreme case, but even like regular bands, they could make a decent living off of albums. Streaming is one of these things that's like really like decimated musical life, because now like you don't have any kind of, income off of your intellectual property, right? You're only making income as a laborer, and that money usually isn't enough. I mean, in my 2018, which was my last full year as a music performer, I made like $14,000 the entire year. And $6,000 went to rent without utilities, which is like for the US like extremely cheap because I lived in New Orleans. But like, I think agitating, for a restructuring of the rules, is going to make a big difference. I mean, for example, Spotify pays 1/3 of 1 cent, for each stream, But it's not just that they're pocketing so much money, but also that these preferential deals mean that if you listen to my music, then your money is going to Rihanna and not to me. Because that's the way that system works, and it's driven also by payola. So that's why like organizations like the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers, are so important, taking on Spotify, and taking on these injustices and like trying to restore some kind of like, balance to like allow us to have some kind of control over our lives, because we don't have it. And you know, on one hand, like there's this growing gap, you know, between musicians, because music and art in general, right, like requires so much prerequisite experience and training, I think, to like engage with it professionally, because it's not just about like, you know, playing the music you like. I mean, for me, most of the music is music that other people like and that they decide what they want to hear. You know, and that requires a lot of training to be able to, you know, learn thousands of songs and just call on them by memory at any time, you know, and then there's this growing gap between like people who like are saying, I'm going to be a musician by all costs. And if that means that like I'm living in the slum, you know, I'm making like $800 a month, you know, I'm barely making rent, I'm like waiting to buy groceries, you know, until I have a gig, or I can't buy lunch until I finish busking, you know, performing in the street, whatever. And then there's on the other side, like people who are independently wealthy, you know, who like, you know, create this like, you know, high class music, you know, that is like a labor of love, a art project, you know, and yeah, like restoring some kind of balance. I think it's a real challenge because of the legal obstacles, the workplace obstacles. Like there's a lot that we have to take on, you know, and that's why I think like, you know, the conventional Marxist struggle like is really important, you know, for art workers, you know, and it's important for us to like understand, you know, like the class issues and understand that like the problems of trying to make it as an artist are not due to us not working hard enough. You know, like on one hand, like, you know, it's like, you know, we live in this objective world, right? So we have to find objective solutions, and we can't just be satisfied with saying, you know, the odds are stacked against us and there's nothing we can do. But then on the other hand, like we have to address the fact that like there is class antagonism in art. You know, it is about choosing sides in some sense because, you know, we're the ones making the art. So we deserve to get paid. It's just that simple.
Yeah, I mean, I have this complication in my head, and it's that, you know, I should never do art to make money, but because I live in this world, I should always expect to get it and fight for it. You know, it's like a complication between those two things. I mean, the other thing that comes to mind, and it's a good way to sort of round off what we've been talking about, is, you know, obviously I think about the international brigades and why they made the choices they did, you know, to come and fight in the Spanish Civil War, you know, and all the contradictions that you're talking about, you know, basically putting bread on the table, roof over your head. These were the reasons I think the international brigades came. And their inspiration obviously is an important lesson for today. So maybe, you know, what's your take and feel of the role of the international brigades? You know, how does that impact you?
I mean, I think that's exactly what we just, you know, touched on, which is that the international brigades are people that say, you know, this is not my fault, but it's my responsibility. You know, we didn't choose to live in a world with fascism, but we know that it won't go away until we make it. We have to make capitalism go away. We have to make fascism go away. You know, that's what unites us, you know, as socialists, right? Is that
Yeah, well, I mean, from an American's point of view, obviously you're an internationalist in your outlook, but you're an American, eh? And sometimes people look over and see, you know, well, Donald Trump's gone now, but he's still got a lot of votes, eh? I mean, there's obviously a growing left and a good radical movement over in the US these days. But what about that as an American? You know, how do you see the direction of the world going in with the right and left question?
I think in one sense, like the settlers argument, like has a certain appeal. A lot of these, extreme right-wing people are people who have a material interest, in maintaining this oppressive system and increasing its oppression, right? I mean, people like, police, right? People like, these, rural, extremely wealthy people. Obviously, like, the most conservative sections of the, major bourgeoisie, like the coal and oil, companies and their personnel, right? And also the people whose like tradition in the U.S. is like founded on exploitation, because their family history, is based on, the genocide of Native Americans and Black Americans, right? But then on the other hand, they're not the majority. They're definitely a minority. And I think that, like as like cliched as it probably sounds to you, like I think that there is just a lot of apathy with the Trump supporters. They just want to see something change, and like if we can like build the momentum around a genuine working class movement, then we will see those people change. I mean, for me, like I remember having a conversation with somebody like a 65, maybe 70-year-old white guy, and talking about, corruption. I mean, I don't know. He just said something real generic, like, the Democratic Party is so corrupt. And I'm like, yeah, and the Republican Party is so corrupt too, and this and that. And then I was like, yeah, man, the solution is, socialism. And he's like, what? No, the solution is, ethnic cleansing and, blah, 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 blah. This typical, like far right, like real uneducated, like, response of just that, like, yeah, the problem is, some boogeyman that's been invented, but like the fact that like up until that point, like we were able to like come to an agreement means that like there are people that are like really genuinely searching for answers. And like what, the left has to do is provide them with genuine support and empathy, like even when it like makes you uncomfortable. And that's not to say that like, we should have like, people of color and like racists, like embracing and like, all this like kumbaya moment kind of thing.
No, you're talking about you're talking about having a program of that people can relate to. So again, we're coming back to that point, hey, about how to make the living struggle something that's relevant, while not forgetting everything else. So listen, Joe, I think it's a good place. I mean, I really like the last point you're making there, because it's basically, let's win people. Let's not go out and convince each other, and talk to somebody I know on the podcast, but let's actually go out there and, put some of these thoughts and ideas into action. And first of all, I'd like to thank you a lot for coming on the podcast, but also for being involved in the Solidarity Park project. I hope very much in the future, as the idea is to do an annual festival, that you will bring your duet or some performance and some more stuff towards the project, because people like you, are the heart of it. So thank you very much for being on the show, and I hope to have you back again soon.
Thank you, Rob. Good to talk to you. Good to see you again. And yeah, until next time.
Yeah, till next time. Bye now.
Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed the show. If you have something to say to us, then join our Facebook group or contact us at outaspace.com. That's outa-space.com. See you soon!